one of the few good things that happened because of the pandemic. This elevated level of awareness in terms of well-being, and I don't think it's something that's going away.
So I feel like the awareness of leaders, of organizations and institutions has really spurred that realization that this is something that has to be sustained, not only because it's the pandemic. It's that awakening.
So I know there are topics, conversations around well-being and wellness. And I know that it has been predefined by many other authorities in the field of well-being and wellness. But on this episode, allow us to actually also differentiate the two. That question being answered first by Jeng.
The difference between well-being and wellness.
Yes.
So, as I mentioned earlier during our outside conversation, apart from spelling, there are three main things that I feel differentiates the two. First is measures. So when we talk about wellness, it's mostly objective measures like your weight, your blood pressure, your nutrition, all these things. For well-being, the measures are both objective because it encompasses wellness and also subjective because somebody can say that my quality of life, for example, that's part of well-being, is good or is bad. It depends on the person speaking about his or her well-being. Secondly, usually it's the first one that people define, the scope. So wellness is just the part that's physical, mental, all these things that can be measured, as I said earlier, objectively measured.
Right.
And then well-being is more encompassing, as he said. So it covers your physical, social, emotional, even spiritual, financial well-being. So all these things that make a human, a person, a whole person, is part of what we consider on well-being now. Last thing is the scope. So whenever we measure wellness, it's usually limited to, let's say, annual physical.
Exactly.
This is your BP at this point. But well-being, when you make interventions for well-being, it's more long-term. The interventions are more than just a year even.
Correct. Which actually, this is a perfect question next to that point is, despite the absence now of COVID, that has been solved for, the focus on wellness is still there because companies still continue to have whatever interventions they have, such as the annual physical examination and whatnot, that actually covers that part. But the aspect of well-being is, there is a surge of conversation and a surge of interventions. To what is it attributed to, this particular surge? Maybe, Ian, you can go ahead on this one first.
I like to say that it's one of the few good things that happened because of the pandemic. This elevated level of awareness in terms of well-being, and I don't think it's something that's going away. I mean, it had to take something very drastic, such as the pandemic, to bring this to the forefront of everyone's minds. And I don't think this is going away. This is going to be constantly in the conversation moving forward, not just from a personal perspective, but in the minds of companies, corporations, in terms of the well-being of their employees. So.
Right. And Jeng, I know you will dovetail to that point. On the surge, why do companies have to, if you already have the, checking the blood markers of the employees, you already have your doctors for their heart and all this stuff, why still invest more beyond wellness? Why still go for well-being? And I love what Ian said, which is, it's not going away. But what does it respond to?
I feel bad about being happy that a lot of people realize the importance of, first was mental health because we were all locked up at home
Yes.
because of the lockdown. So a lot of people were forced to introspect about the importance of health in all its aspects, physical, mental, because you can't go out, you can't jump, run, and do the usual things that you do. So, and these people are everyone, because it's a pandemic, not just the people who cannot afford good health care, good HMO. So now, the leaders before who had access to all these things, Sometimes they don't even think about how those who don't have enough financial resources to provide for themselves now realize that I am only as vulnerable as the most vulnerable person around me. So I feel like the awareness of leaders, of organizations and institutions has really spurred that realization that this is something that has to be sustained. Not only because it's the pandemic. It's that awakening. Kasi before, it's like selling and selling. As an HR professional, it feels like a gargantuan task to persuade your leaders to give this and that to employees, especially mental care. No, we don't have that because it's expensive. It's not part of the HMO. But now there's the realization of everyone, especially the decision makers. And they know that it's important for everyone to have access to it.
Correct.
I feel that that's what's sustaining it. Because if the leaders, the decision makers did not realize that then.
So this is not a simple checklist for the Department of Labor and Employment. So you feel like there's genuine concern, really.
Yeah, again, from the corporate lens, I think it's more of semi self-serving as well, because they realize that the well-being of their employees directly ties into how well they're performing, how productive they are. And so, it's really also in their best interest to look after the well-being of their employees in order for that to translate into the things that you're looking into whenever you're running a business.
So can we go and jump into some more maybe fresh and dynamic options utilized by companies, to as intervention to manage the well-being of their employees? So can you name a few that you have actually experienced if you're running a program in your company? What are those that you feel like it went beyond the normal call of duty or the box of responsibility that most companies would have taken?
I'm very fortunate that we were together in our previous company as early as early 2000, mid 2000, where we are already offering employee assistance programs, counseling.
True.
Now that's just the bare minimum.
Correct.
So
that was circa
2007, right? So
barring your words before it became fashionable.
Now we call it traditional.
Yes.
That
became baseline.
It is now baseline. So there are more, I know, and we at Radix HR, when I was still with Radix HR, started silver lining.
Yes. Maybe that's something you can talk about, Ian. Like, how does it actually help customers your customers right now from the banking industry and from the BPO to have access to this kind of service?
Well, silver lining, it's basically it's your run-of-the-mill mental wellness EAP, but we have some innovations that we're implementing, mainly us not being passive in terms of how we are making ourselves known to the employees. So
how so?
Basically we do temp checks, which are regular individual communications to all of the employees to make sure that they're basically aware that the service is available to them, just like their HMOs.
So that it's not forgotten, that it's a service that's actually available.
Exactly. I mean, there are a lot of EAPs that basically are just in the background. They're there, assuming that the employees are fully aware that the service is, it's more proactive. Good point, Jeng. So we're more proactive in terms of how we communicate to the employees. And that's one of the things that
because sometimes that's all you need, right? Sometimes you forget that you're a human being. Sometimes you need a friend or a non-friend to just tell you, hey, I'm here, just in case there's something you want to talk about. Whether it's good, bad, something to celebrate. Sometimes we're just so busy working on so many things that we forget. Hi, I need to...
And most of the cases that our counselors handle, it's really not from people who have actual mental health conditions. It's really just people who are enduring a bad phase. They're going through a breakup. Their workload is too much. So it's more acute rather than chronic issues that we're dealing with.
Which is good.
Which is actually
because
good.
That's where we need to catch it.
Correct. Before it becomes worse than it actually is.
Preventive. It should be preventive.
Fantastic. But Jeng, in your own perspective, both as an HR professional and perhaps some of us are also dynamic users of the service, what would you like to see differently?
Oh my gosh. Baka umabot tayong 2 hours dito. So, I'm very passionate about this. You know this, Marie, because I've been diagnosed with clinical depression as early as 2007.
Mhm.
And I talk about it because I want people to realize that it is a condition. It's like having cancer, although it's not terminal, but it could be for those who are self-harming and all that. But it's not talked about so much. And it's typically very taboo to have somebody in an organization who has it. That's something I want to change. If there's
Exactly.
anything, no? Kasi, say for example, the typical questions during conferences and meetings about mental health is, okay, but how do we know if somebody, might be at the verge of having a mental breakdown? How do I prevent that in the office? I
Right.
mean, a lot of people, particularly people who have managers,
Hmm.
those who have direct reports, would be so scared and they would always go to us,
Actually.
to HR, and say, can we just have a psychological test and have that on the screening phase? Let's not hire na people who might be having depressions,
This is
panic
actually
attacks,
discriminatory. in
which,
essence.
of course, that's health, right? And we don't say that for people who have asthma. What if there's pollen when they step out of the house? Naku, baka asthmahin,
That's
hindi
true.
makapag-perform ng job. I mean, that's my
On
heartache
something,
talaga.
yan,
Na
heartache,
parang
oo.
that's such a big ignorance to me when people ask about, what if this person would just have it's pretty much the same. How can I tell if somebody's gonna have a heart attack?
Correct. Correct.
So we have to be more preventive. We have to talk about it openly so that we can prevent it, we can help people and
Right.
truly support them as leaders.
So you feel that's one area where most of the companies can actually add on to their arsenal, no, on well-being, which is to do more informational campaign around it and to teach their leaders how to
Have
manage
it accessible
Okay.
because it's so expensive just to be able to talk to someone. And it should be because it's a hard job. I mean, imagine talking to somebody every day with having stress, undergoing whatever,
Right.
it is. And
Right.
that's why it can be expensive, but it's something that we have to give access to if we really care about our
Agree.
people.
Yeah, and one thing Jeng was mentioning, it's expensive, but one thing from a numbers perspective, one thing that we've found is that close to 90% of the cases that we handle with our mental wellness EAP, we don't end up escalating them to actual
Yes.
psychologists
Yes.
even.
Yes.
Our counselors there, whenever certain case is already beyond their capabilities, then they can escalate it to a psychologist, which is the expensive part, actually.
Yes.
Because EAPs, they're pretty affordable these days.
Right.
But that's something that we also need to realize is that there's a lot of the cases we can nip them in the bud without having to escalate to a psychologist or for a psychiatrist. And that's, in our experience, it's the vast majority. Again, close to 90%, we're able to effectively handle at the first level, and they never even have to reach the tier 2 or tier 3.
Apart from the accessibility when it comes to the cost of it, it's the stigma.
Right.
People are so scared to even talk to the counselors that are available to them now because the numbers are reported to HR. Nako, baka sabihin I have,
The
And
stigma is
people
still there.
have, it's still there. And that's why it's so important for the leaders to assure everyone that that's confidential. It's like
Correct.
going to a lawyer. It's going
Correct.
to your doctor.
Correct.
Medical conditions, all of those information are confidential. So
Perfect.
no one can share that. So people have to hear that.
So I want to go back to a question pertaining to silver lining because I think one question that need to be asked is that, okay, you're providing the service to a bank and also a couple of BPO companies, but what has been the take-up rate so far?
Well, it's a bit of a range. So on the low end, it's what a lot of EAPs would typically see, which is less than 1%. And
Wow.
on the high range, it's about a little over 5%, which is actually good. 5% is sort of the sweet spot. You never want to see it creeping towards the double digit
Of
mark.
course.
That means your workforce is already in a pretty bad state. But
Right.
I think what's important to point out, based on what we've observed throughout the 3 years of silver lining is that the take-up rate is directly correlated to the level of engagement of the company's HR. So,
Which is a question I really want to ask. So you answer the
yeah,
question,
yeah.
like, to what do we owe the take-up rate, at a higher level to, so now you're saying it's the engagement of the HR and the management of the company in, okay.
Because, I mean, despite the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, we try to have a more proactive approach in terms of disseminating information, communicating to employees about the availability of this service. Still, it's important that the HR representatives are truly engaged in terms of communicating this to their employees. So, for example, the one that I mentioned that is averaging about 5%, they're HR BPs. They're very active in terms of reminding their supervisors or their people leaders, basically, that if you're seeing any of your teammates that might benefit from this service, then you immediately recommend or remind them that there is this service that's
exactly.
available to them. So it can be as simple as that. So yeah, I think that's the key to the efficacy of any service, ours included.
Perfect. That said, I want to go into yet another intervention, which is, in my opinion, fresh. And I'm not just saying that only because we kind of work together to put it as one holistic service, but talk more about intentional pause, because I did see and look upon them as the healthcare avengers of the Philippines. Say more about it.
Well, intentional pause, it's more of, I think it was pretty serendipitous, us having met certain people who are engaged in different aspects of wellness and well-being. And it really was just us realizing that we're in a position to put together something holistic, something that's more than the usual executive. We haven't even discussed what intentional pause is, but it's basically a holistic executive retreat. So it's specifically for business leaders, for C-level executives. And the premise is, I mean, these are the people that have the most stressful jobs, if you think about it. They're the ones that typically work the longest. They have so much more on their plate than everyone else because the entire enterprise basically depends on them. And we thought that it was high time to put something together that's specific for these executives, like I mentioned. And again, we were fortunate that we met this group of people that enabled us to put something like a truly holistic program that deals with someone's professional growth, your social health.
Can we mention some of the names in the roster of?
Yeah,
perfect.
Sure. One aspect that we deal with in intentional pause is nutrition. Obviously, there's a pretty popular saying that our health really is 80% what we put in our bodies, and the other 20% is just the exercise. Our lead nutritionist, his name's Oka Sanyes. He's a big name in the corporate world, but after he was done with that phase of his life, he has really gotten into health and wellness, nutrition primarily. So he's our nutrition guru, and the retreat comprises of 10 coaches that we're employing.
Wow,
and
that's a lot.
It's really, to my knowledge, it's first of its kind here in the Philippines. So.
Absolutely. Perfect. And so I want to end this talk on well-being and wellness with yet another question, which is, what can companies do differently? I know we talked about the interventions that are traditional, and then these are the ones that are non-traditional, fresh. What else does our employees need, or does our leaders need, to be productive and healthy, not only for the company, but more so for themselves and the family that they have? Is there anything top of mind aside from the education? I love that you said about educating the leaders about how to manage and care for these cases. Are there more needed?
Man in the mirror. If you want to make the world a better place, so you have to be that role model as leaders, right? I mean, 90% of the time, if they see you actually doing it, being focused on your well-being, apart from being inspired, the part of you that's also gonna cringe, so embarrassing. My CEO is there working out, pumping, and I'm here not really participating. So, it makes a huge difference when the leaders really practice it because they realize it for themselves. And when you feel good, you just want to share that. So I feel like you really have to try it and you really have to make it intentional. Kaya intentional pause.
Correct.
So we're so busy, we needed a pandemic to pause.
Correct. Well, it's not right, but thankfully, as you mentioned and referenced earlier, it's one of the good things about the pandemic. That said, I think we will end this particular segment. I know there's more to be discussed, and we'll create another avenue for our audience to listen more and tune in to anything conversation about wellness and well-being. Thank
Coping
you.
mechanisms, Kat.
Yes. So thanks to Ian Macasaet and Jeng Macalagay.